Library of Congress. Welcome to the 2011 National Book Festival. We hope you all are having a wonderful day and have been enjoying the great authors we have here. Before we begin, I want to inform you that the pavilion's presentations are being filmed for the Library of Congress's website and for their archives, and by C-SPAN for airing on BookTV. So please be mindful of this as you enjoy the presentation. In addition, please do not sit on the camera risers that are located in the back of the pavilion. And please silence your cell phones, please. So that's a disclaimer, and we'll move on. We have a wonderful writer who's going to speak to us. Let me first say I'm Kevin Merida. That's what I should have said. I'm Kevin Merida, the national editor at the Washington Post, and we're proud charter sponsors of this festival for the last 11 years, and it's great to be with you. James L. Swanson, the first thing I noticed about his bio is that he was born on February 12th, which happens also to be the birthday of Abraham Lincoln. And so you could say in a way that he was destined to write the Edgar Award-winning and New York Times bestseller Manhunt, The 12-Day Chase for Lincoln's Killer, upon which the young reader's version, Chasing Lincoln's Killer, is based. Manhunt was listed by Entertainment Weekly in 2006 as one of the 10 best books of the year, and it was cited in Newsweek as one of the 2 best nonfiction crime books ever written. Truman Capote's In Cold Blood was the other. His latest book, Bloody Crimes, The Chase for Jefferson Davis and the Death Pageant for Lincoln's Corpse, is another Civil War-era thriller. It weaves together in riveting fashion the hunt to round up Jefferson Davis, Confederate president, and the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination, and the majestic 20-day rolling train funeral that brought Lincoln's body back to Springfield, 1,600-mile journey. James has a degree in history from the University of Chicago, where he was taught by the eminent historian John Hope Franklin, and a law degree from UCLA. He has worked at think tanks and in government here in Washington. He has written for the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Smithsonian Magazine, and has been active with the Ford Theater here and the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. But what I learned last night at a celebration for the authors at the Library of Congress, and chatting with them, made me like him even more. James Swanson is a lover of writers. And in talking with him and Andrea, they have hosted a lot of book parties. They've, like many of us who like reading, have collected books even when we didn't have shelf space, and stacked them up because they support writers. We were joking about going to book parties, and James always does them really well, he and Andrea, and great food and wine, and for people who come and then they don't buy the books. And we were just lamenting that because we support writers, because that is part of the way we learn about each other. Writing is part of discovery in this great nation and the world, and how we learn about each other. He is a writer who deserves our support. He's a beautiful writer, and he will also be signing his books from 2 to 3 p.m. So without further delay, let me introduce to you James L. Swanson. Give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Kevin, for that kind introduction. Last night, one thing Kevin told me that he didn't mention to you, he gave me a dire warning about the dangers of collecting books. I have over 3,000 books at our house in Washington. My wife, who's an economics professor, must have 1,000 books just on her subjects. And Kevin warned me of a book fanatic whose house literally exploded from the weight of the books on the support beams. And beneath this pile of books was found the dead body of the crazed collector of these books. And so I'm getting a little worried because we do have a library room at home, and in that room are 2,000 books alone, and I think I'm going to call an engineer over to look at that room because I don't want the house to explode. This is the third time I've spoken at the festival, and I see some of you, I've seen you before at this festival, so if you've heard me speak before, you know that one thing I don't like to do is do a reading from the book. I go to a lot of book events myself, and I get a little bored if someone just reads from the book because they think, well, I could do that myself. I want to hear about things that aren't in the book, like who they are, how they got started, what they're interested in, what they learned from doing the book, what surprised them about doing the book. Have they been threatened by any members of the public for doing the book? I'll get to one of those. And so I thought I'd talk a little about how I did this 2 books, which really are a trilogy of stories, and how I got into this, and how I do these books. And then I'll talk about what I think my favorite themes are in the Bloody Crimes book, and what it means at this time of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. I had not planned to write about Abraham Lincoln and the assassination. There were other books I wanted to do. When my agent said, "What do you want to do next?" I said, well, when I was a boy, my grandmother was a great storyteller. She worked for the old Chicago tabloid newspapers at the end of that Ben Hecht age, the Chicago Sun, the Times, the Sun-Times, the Daily News. And when I was little, she would tell me sometimes horrific stories. And I remember when I was 8 or 9 years old, she said, "Did you know that during the World's Fair of 1893, an insane doctor murdered 100 girls and dissolved their bodies in acid?" Well, I was 8 or 9. And so I told my agent, when I was a boy, my grandmother told me, and he said, "She told you that when you were a little boy?" And I said, "Yes, I want to do that book." And he said, "Well, unfortunately, do you know who Eric Larson is?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I happen to know he's halfway finished writing a book which is going to be called Devil in the White City, so you can't do that." Well, then I said, well, when I was a boy, my father told me a great story. He went to Lane Tech High School in Chicago during World War II, and the teachers would point to a desk and say, "At that desk sat Herbert Hans Haupt, one of 8 Nazi saboteurs landed by Nazi U-boat on the shores of New Jersey in 1942 to do sabotage, and then he was executed. But he lived in Chicago and assimilated very much." And I'd always thought about that story. And then my first day working at the Department of Justice during the Reagan administration, my office was on the 5th floor, the Attorney General's floor, with all that great WPA art and paintings and sculptures. And there was an interesting thing on the wall opposite my office was a bronze plaque that said, "In this room were tried the 8 Nazi saboteurs." So I called my dad and said, "You're not going to believe it. The Nazis were in the office right across from me, and that's where they were put on trial." So I told my agent that story. I said, "I want to write about the 8 Nazi saboteurs." And he said, "Well, the good news is there is no author out there." This was shortly after September 11th, when there was great resurgence of interest in terrorism and bombings and attacks on America. He said, "The good news is there is not an author out there who's in the middle of writing a book on the Nazi saboteurs. There are 3 authors simultaneously writing 3 books on the same subject. So you have to give that up." Then I said, well, I remember when I was a little boy, my grandfather, who was on the Chicago police force from the 1930s, the Al Capone era, to the late 1960s, the civil rights protests and the anti-Vietnam War protests, told me many wild stories. One day I remember he came home, and I heard him do a whisper to the family, "Don't let Jamie read the newspaper tonight." So, of course, the 6 or 7-year-old curious boy that I was, I had to read the Sun-Times. And so I read the headline, "Madman slaughters 9 student nurses with knife." You might remember, some of you might remember the name of Richard Speck, the notorious murderer. And I researched him, and he was such a horrible man. And it was such a sad and unredeeming story. It caused my agent to say, "Do you want to spend the next 2 years of your life with Richard Speck?"